welcome to the Public Forum, The Cost of Ivory. I'm Oscar Eustace, Artistic Director of the Public, and we have decided to do this forum because of Lynn Nottage's extraordinary play, MLIMA'S TALE. And we're really grateful not only for you being here, but for writing the play. What we do in the Public Forum is try to continue the issues that are raised by the plays into a broader public conversation. And there's no better way to do that than with the company we have. Chelsea Clinton, who is Vice Chair of the Clinton Global Initiative and has done an enormous amount of work on the issue of poaching. And John Calvelli, who is Executive Vice President of the Public Affairs Division of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And both of these guys, separately and together, are experts in this field. And welcome to all of you. So maybe, Chelsea, I could start by, could you give us just a snapshot of what the condition of African elephants are today, what our situation is?
Sure. I just also want to echo my gratitude to Lynn for being the catalyst for all of us being here and for writing something that I hope will bring more people into this conversation and into this work. And it's always a pleasure to be with my friend John and to be a kind of fellow warrior on the path to save Africa's elephants. And it's always just a joy to be with and around Oscar. So thank you for bringing us all together today. We think that in the 1500s there were probably more than 25 million African elephants. And yet, even then, poaching and the hunting, illegal hunting of elephants was something that the elephant populations had to contend with. But really, starting in the 1800s, with kind of more people, thankfully, kind of coming out of poverty, kind of there being a growing middle class, and then really with the mass production of goods, particularly things like ivory combs, ivory piano keys, the African elephant population was under tremendous stress, and we started to see the first evidence of mass poaching. Kind of that only became more true as, unfortunately, the weapons that hunters could hunt with became kind of more sophisticated, really kind of into the 20th century. And so kind of by the late 20th century, the population had cratered from where it had been a few hundred years before. And so by the time I was born in 1980, there were probably just over 1 million African elephants left. And so an awareness of kind of the threat facing the elephant population led to kind of all sorts of things, which I am sure John can really speak to, trying to regulate the ivory trade. But those didn't work. So kind of a decade later, the African elephant population had been cut in half. And then today we think we have fewer than 400,000 African elephants, and we have good data that shows 96 elephants are killed every day for their ivory. And so while...
which is one every 15 minutes.
Which is one every 15 minutes. And so while I have been criticized for saying this, it's true even though it sounds dramatic. If we don't stop the poaching of Africa's elephants, my children who are 1.5 and 3.5 will grow up in a world without elephants. And that is just a future I refuse to contemplate without thinking about everything I can do to try to change that.
That's extraordinary. John, maybe you could guide us through some of the attempts to stop this or to control this over the last decades and why things haven't worked and what our possible mechanisms for the future are.
Well, I think, first of all, I just want to echo what Chelsea said. It's always a pleasure to be here with this august group, and I say that because this is not an issue that you usually come to the public theater to hear about. So I just want to commend the public theater for taking this on and Lynn for writing an incredible play, because how do you put a human face to this story, which is really the destruction of Africa's biodiversity and Africa's natural heritage? And there's been many efforts, and just for a moment, I want to come back to America and come back to New York and Connecticut. Because one of the things that's most amazing about this story is that, as Chelsea mentioned, it was about 1.2 million, it was down to about 400,000. New York in the United States is one of the largest markets for ivory. It has been historically. And when I say historically, about 85 to 90% of all the ivory that Chelsea referenced that was being utilized for ivory keys and things of that nature was actually processed in Connecticut in a town called Ivoryton. You should just think about that.
Wow.
The way that ivory got there was on the back of African slaves that brought the ivory tusks from Central Africa to Zanzibar, and then it was shipped to Connecticut. And then it was shipped from Connecticut after it was processed to New York City, to the Bronx and Queens actually, which is why you have something called the piano factory in the South Bronx. They made the pianos there, and that was done with ivory. So we're all complicit to some extent in this story, and New York as well.
And this is New York going back to the 18th century.
18th century, 19th century. I'm going to bring you to New York of last summer. Last summer in Central Park, we actually were able to destroy $8 million of illegal ivory that had been seized in New York in approximately 2 years. So therefore, we oftentimes spend a lot of time talking about places around the world. We need to think about what's happening right here at home. So what are we trying to do? And really, thanks to Chelsea and to Secretary Clinton, we really were able to bring this to the global stage in a way that was incredibly impactful. And we came up with a pretty simple strategy, which was stop the killing, stop the trafficking, and stop the demand. And in 2013, at the Clinton Global Initiative, we launched 96 Elephants campaign, which is really about helping to raise awareness. And the thing that we wanted to do was to close ivory markets. We realized that what had been done in the past was not working, so we really needed to reset the conversation. Thankfully, in New York, we were able to close it, New Jersey as well, then in California, and then in Hawaii, which are the largest markets in the United States. And thanks to the work that we all did, the Obama administration also passed a ban, which then led the Chinese to also introduce a ban, which went into effect in January. So I say that because all of these things build upon each other, and the United Kingdom literally a few weeks ago announced that they're closing their markets, and now we're working on the European Union to do the same thing. So all of these things build upon each other, and we've seen the cratering of the prices for ivory and an increase in funding at the local level on the issue of helping with trafficking on the ground.
That's an astonishing set of good news. Subject that we've gotten. It's interesting because what's so beautiful politically about stopping the poaching, stopping the trade, stopping the demand, that sort of following the whole supply line along, is it does implicate everybody, just the way your play does, Lynn. And could you? This is. My respect for you is so enormous, and I'm glad that at least twice the Pulitzer Committee has shared that. But this is, for me, a very Lynn Nottage move, to take a subject that would seem to be impossible to dramatize and figure out how to dramatize it. Can you talk about how you first became aware of this?
Sure, and I have to begin by saying I'm just very thankful that I get to engage with both of you from a distance in the incredible work that you're doing, and I feel blessed that something is happening. When I first, I've always been a lover of animals, and in particular elephants, but I've always been very passive in my activism. Like so many of us, from a distance, I know this is happening, but I've done very little. And then 5 years ago, director Catherine Bigelow came to me, and she was outraged. I mean, we'd sit down and talk, and literally her body would shake. She's like, I'm fearful that there's going to be another elephant genocide as there was in the 1970s and the 1980s. And she's like, I want to do something. And I don't think that making a movie is going to be enough. I want to do something that really builds empathy, something that's visceral, something that's immediate, and forces people when they leave to engage. And so I said, why don't we write a piece of theater? Because that's exactly what theater can do. And she sent me reams and reams of research that she had been doing, trying to figure out how to engage with this issue. And I began pouring through it. And as I poured through it, I became more and more angry and thought, absolutely I have to do something. Even though this is not in the lane of what I generally do, now it is. But when I first began, it wasn't. And so that's really the evolution of my trying to engage with this issue.
What is so extraordinary about kind of now knowing that Catherine was part of this genesis is that she came to an event my mother and I did on a different topic probably 5 years ago in Los Angeles, and said, I'm happy to be here listening to you. I think we were talking about early childhood education, but what I really want to talk to you about is elephants. And so we actually met with her
Oh, great.
and talked about elephants and connected her kind of to a lot of the activists, and also connected her to Wild Aid, where I know she was really helpful.
That's right.
In helping with some of the Wild Aid work to kind of really educate people around the world, particularly in Asia, that ivory only comes from dead elephants, because that's been one of our main impediments in stopping the demand. Is there is this widely shared belief that ivory regenerates.
Yeah.
And that there are safe ways to remove ivory, and ivory regenerates, and so the elephants aren't harmed. Whereas we know the elephants are often slaughtered for their ivory, and even if you could remove the tusks, the elephants are dependent on their tusks for their survival. And so I just am so thankful to know that kind of beyond helping Wild Aid, I think, make much better content for their campaigns throughout China and Vietnam, Thailand, elsewhere, that she recruited you to this. So just that, I'm so thankful to know that.
And but it's also so interesting. This is almost like a paradigm of how we'd like this to work. That we talk to each other about issues that are actually happening in the culture. We bring in artists who care about this passionately. They link to other artists, and we manage to take a conversation that's happening on the political and intellectual level and find a way to include the art as part of the conversation.
It's funny you say that, because most communities at times are very difficult to bring people together. So the Wildlife Conservation Society that I work for, we felt it was important to we couldn't do this alone, and Chelsea referenced Wild Aid. What Secretary Clinton did very early on is, I call it the Central Park Zoo meeting. You know, we brought everyone together, from National Geographic to the World Wildlife Fund to the Nature Conservancy, etc. I mean, it was just this incredible group that came together, and we all agreed on those three basic principles. Now, everybody can go off and do what they need to do, and again, Wild Aid does great work. The important thing was that we understood these were the basic principles that we were working on, and then move on and work in your sphere. And that's been, I think, for us, the exciting part, to see that coming together of a community to work on this.
And of course, it's such a beautiful model, the fact that you can say some positive things about what's happening in the world, that activism works, that you can actually make an impact by trying to unite to do the right thing.
I got to tell you, for me, one of those incredible moments was taking the chief of law enforcement to West 57th Street with a group of congressional staff. And we walked from store to store, and what ended up happening was we were able to see ivory on sale. And I said, this is happening in New York right now. And what's exciting is that a few years later, Vice on HBO does a show on a bust that was done on the law that we worked on.
Oh, wow.
And that we were able to be a part of, and now we're helping to get this ivory off the market and helping to save elephants in Africa.
That is so exciting. Lynn, could you talk just a little bit about the structure of MLIMA'S Tale? Because it's such an unusual structure, and I think so brilliantly captures exactly what this
Sure, just a synopsis for those who may not have seen the play. It's the story of MLIMA, who is one of the last great tuskers in Kenya, and he's poached for these magnificent, beautiful tusks that he has. And the story is really a ghost story of the way in which MLIMA haunts all of those who are part of trading his tusks. And so the story is in a Laurent structure in which you begin with the poachers and then follow every single person involved in the trade up to finally the consumer, who literally is in an ivory tower overlooking the city of Beijing in a skyscraper that's practically touching the skies. And I really want to show how almost everyone who briefly touches the ivory is complicit in the trade.
Right. But what's so beautiful about that is you simultaneously are showing everybody's complicity, but somehow you also understand the point of view of everybody involved in it, which helps to understand that it's a system that it's at work. It's not evil individual people.
Right. And so the phrase that always is the guiding principle when I'm writing my plays is sustaining the complexity, in that no one is ultimately a villain. Everyone is doing this for multiple reasons, beginning with the poachers in Kenya, who were once farmers, who no longer can farmers and pastoralists who can no longer graze their cows, and so they have to find ways to survive, and poaching is a very quick, easy fix. And also I think one of the things that you see in the play is just the escalating price of the ivory as it moves up the food chain. The poacher, when he first sells the ivory, it's $60 to $200 per kilogram. By the time it's sold in a store in China, it's $2,500 per kilogram, and that poacher sees next to nothing of that. Not that we want them to, but that's just the chain of command, that so many people are doing this out of desperation.
And then further down,
then
it's
further
greed.
down, it becomes about it becomes about desire, and it becomes about consumption. It becomes about status. The further you get away from the actual crime.
That's one of the reasons in our work with WCS and all of our partners in the Elephant Action Network, we actually started to work with luxury brands to try to help there be a substitutive effect, particularly in the countries that are represent such a large share of ivory demand, including China. So to work with luxury brands on products that would help raise awareness about kind of the inevitable correlation, like ivory and dead elephant, but also like really beautiful things that could be substitutive for ivory, right? You don't need ivory as a status symbol if you have like a Louis Vuitton bag, right? Like get a Louis Vuitton bag instead of like, an ivory like handled pouch, right? So just things like that might seem not immediately obvious, like we also have been finding traction with.
It's interesting you say that, because there is so much good news with this ban in China, but there is still a lot of ignorance about the purchasing of ivory. When I was having my photograph taken very recently, the New York Times photographer said to me, "I just purchased an ivory pipe in Tanzania." She said, "But it was antique." And I was like, oh my God, I'm the absolute wrong person to tell that to. But she didn't really think there was anything wrong with it because, quote unquote, it was antique. I said, number one, you don't know that it's antique. Right. That could be the propaganda that's being sold to you so that you will purchase it.
I have to share. First of all, I never really disagree with Chelsea, but I have to here because it would not be Louis Vuitton, it'd be a Gucci. As an Italian, I have to say that. So just let me start with that.
We've actually been working with Louis Vuitton, but I'd love to work with Gucci too.
We have to
send
get
them my way.
So
I think this is the first time that these names have been mentioned.
Yeah, come along. It's really fascinating because what's happening, right, is they will take ivory. If you bury it for a couple of weeks, it starts to look old, and then they try to sell it as
antiques.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, and because there's no way to carbon date ivory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We haven't been able to develop a test that is sufficiently robust to assess
without
the
destroying
age of ivory,
it.
without destroying it.
And
so
we have a dear friend, George Amato, who actually has done some of those studies on the portion of that $8 million, and it found that these animals had been killed in the last couple of years. Wow. So therefore, when you see antique or mammoth, that's not what's happening.
But the other thing that you point out, though, in a couple of articles that I really loved is the idea that by destroying the demand for it, that's sending a protective shield over the elephants who are still alive, just trying to work against the idea that ivory is a status symbol, that ivory is a luxury, whether it's old or new. It's just reducing, and that seems so smart to me.
And I think that, as working with Chelsea, the thing that's most important is this idea that it's all three pillars, right? Because this is a long-term game. It's exciting to stand up here and say we've been able to do this and close this ban and the price is lowered. But at the end of the day, there are millions of people around the world that still would be more than happy to purchase ivory. We need to change that. In the interim, we need to change the laws to make sure that people understand there's a price to pay if they buy it. But they have to understand, as Chelsea was saying, that people need to understand that the elephant tusk does not fall off. That they have to understand that what they're doing is really destroying the natural heritage and biodiversity at its core.
Exactly.
Well, and I think one of the things that, and I don't want to give too much away from MLIMA'S TALE, but one of the things I think that Lynn does so well is also to show those vulnerable points of where, if there were kind of sufficient resources and intentions from law enforcement, the trafficking could be interrupted.
Right.
And I think you do that so well. And one of the areas where we also started to see some success is with some of the African countries who really do take this very seriously and are passing much more stringent laws, but also enforcing those laws. And so we now have seen traffickers, facing prison sentences of a dozen years or more, correlated to how much ivory they're kind of in possession of. So clearly correlating to how many elephants must have been slaughtered for that ivory. And that I also find really encouraging.
Can I ask you a question with relating to that? Because one of the things that I discovered when I was doing my research is that a lot of the poaching occurs in places where there is lawlessness and places where there are conflict. And so how do we target those zones in which there isn't any government?
Well, I think
I
know John's done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things, just to pick up a little bit, when we announced 96 elephants at the Clinton Foundation, we had six leaders from Africa there, and about 11 had signed a pledge saying, please stop selling ivory. That had jumped to over 20 now. So we have most of the range countries are on board, and it came from them. And I think that's important to understand. It's the African nations themselves. Having said that, Lynn, to pick up on your point, there is a significant problem with corruption and lawlessness, et cetera. And if you don't deal with the value issue, the value proposition, that's going to continue. The U.S. government has done, and the Europeans as well, and now even the Chinese, is they're working on that supply chain. They're working on those issues. So, for example, we've been working with many groups like IVORY and the African Wildlife Foundation, putting sniffer dogs in the trafficked ports, because now those dogs can actually work on not only ivory but guns and also drugs. So that therefore we're working in specific points to interrupt the chain, right? The fact is, at the end of the day, what Chelsea was referencing is very true. Many of these countries have stepped up and started to bring these people to justice. Is it perfect? No.
But it's happening.
And just to add one additional point, which kind of we were talking a little bit about before, Lynn, I think one of the reasons kind of so many African countries now are leading on this, and we're just grateful to be able to support their efforts, is not only because of the economic imperative, right? If the elephants and we know lion populations are also under threat, rhinos are under deep threat, if those animals disappear, their tourism will dry up, and for many, particularly of the East African countries, tourism represents more than 20% of their GDP. Right. So it's not a small part of their economy. But what I think is also driving this is the security imperative, right? Because these governments don't want areas of lawlessness, and they don't want Al-Shabaab or the Janjaweed or Al-Qaeda North Africa exploiting ivory to help then kind of grease the wheels on the supply chains that enable them to funnel drugs, guns, people. And so they're interested in helping on kind of combating the ivory trade, leading on combating the ivory trade, not only because it's kind of morally the right thing to do and economically the smart thing to do, but also it's a security imperative for them now.
And you've been mentioning backstage that much of the actual poaching is now organized and criminal in a large way, in a way that's different, or at least increasingly so.
I mean, that's certainly what we hear from our partners on the ground, from the kind of wildlife forces on the ground, kind of from the kind of NGOs, often like domestic NGOs who have been tireless in this space for decades sometimes, that they have seen a real shift in poaching in the last decade. That yes, often like the poachers themselves may be kind of from the communities, although increasingly there's also reports of largely Chinese poachers, although not entirely, who are kind of part of large criminal syndicates, so that the syndicate is capturing more of the economics.
And we saw, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, that Grace Mugabe
Yes.
was implicated in an ivory syndicate.
Yep. It's just, the fact is, I spoke recently to the head of the National Park Service in Gabon, and he was working with the government to bring action, and there was indications that Boko Haram had been working in Gabon. So this is an international, cross-border issue that is incredibly complicated, but I think at least now I see good intentions on the ground to a large extent. People realize the scale of the problem, and to Chelsea's point about this sense of instability, if we don't deal with this issue, these are the beginning of other crimes as well. These routes are not just being used for ivory, they're being used for guns, they're being used for trafficking of people. So by taking care of this issue, I think we're also having a positive impact in other areas as well.
I hate to bring it back home, but I feel the need to bring it back home. We've had in the last 14 months or so some changes in our government's attitude towards the ivory trade, and I wonder if you'd talk a little to us about that, Chelsea.
I think we've had changes in the government's view to kind of environmental and ecosystem health broadly. And the reason I start with that, kind of to reference back to something that John said, is that elephants are what are known as a keystone species. You know, they are kind of the linchpin that helps keep their local ecosystems healthy. You know, their footprints truly become the water holes for small animals. Their voracious diets for different types of leaves kind of admittedly get pooped out to help build ecological health and ecological diversity in a broader space. And so the kind of callousness that we see toward elephants, I think, you know, Oscar, what you're referencing in kind of the now permission, kind of there was permission, then it was reversed, now we've gone back to permission, of case-by-case allowance of elephant trophy entrance into the United States, to me is so infuriating, not only because it kind of, I think, sets back the US government's moral authority to really be a leader in this issue, and even more importantly, to be kind of an effective actor in stopping elephant poaching. But it also, once again, signals how little regard this administration has for kind of environmental and ecological sustainability and health.
Is there any conceivable justification for allowing this?
No.
I can't see any
No.
argument for it that isn't totally venal. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Venal and narcissistic, which I think Lynn's play does such a beautiful job of illuminating. I mean, I think it's what we were calling greed earlier, but kind of this sense that somehow the hunter who would bring back the ivory that he or she would have harvested from an elephant that he or she would have killed, that somehow that deserves greater valuing than not only the value of that elephant's life, but the collective investment that we would be making in our shared future by protecting that elephant today.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it speaks to just the corruption of the spirit, that one must possess something in its totality. And yeah.
I will say, though, that one of the great things about this issue historically has been that it's been a bipartisan issue, that we can go to Capitol Hill and meet with Democrats and Republicans, and still in Congress there is that spirit of bipartisan support for conservation and global conservation, despite some of the proposals by this administration on cutting of funding for global conservation or wildlife trafficking. The Congress has actually put those funds back in. And in the early days of this administration, there was an executive order that came out that spoke about wildlife trafficking and saying that it was a transnational crime. So there's somebody in there, we're going to find him, but that still believes in these issues. But I think from the perspective of the bulwark, the Congress has really been an incredible asset for our community in some of these issues. And to paraphrase your dad, you know, I come from a place of hope. So,
which is beautiful, and I believe that this is a bipartisan issue, and that's a gorgeous thing, which does not necessarily negate the fact that we've got trouble about how our country's being run, and that's a bipartisan issue.
I will say, though, and certainly, and John can speak to this as well. You know, I've heard from like my friends who were working on the ivory ban in the UK that it moved more quickly after the election, because there was this sense of concern, and then particularly after the administration kind of has said what it has said about kind of now relaxing the trophy ban effectively, because that's really what they're doing. And once they're going to allow a case-by-case basis, it really is kind of a signal of not kind of being as committed to that. That kind of further spurred kind of activists and the UK government to kind of move toward a total ban. So I think thankfully, again, because I also, to quote my friend Jim Kim, believe optimism is a moral choice. Thankfully, we do see not only still tremendous work at the state level here in the United States, powerfully again by kind of countries who are on the front line and activists there, but also kind of other countries trying to step into this moral void in powerful ways.
I think it actually speaks to a larger issue, which is this movement, especially in this country, where cities and states are actually leading on the policy agenda right now, where what we did with IVORY and closing markets at the state level then spurred a national movement, then spurred a global movement. I'm a firm believer that the greatest policies and the greatest work is going to be done in the cities and cities like New York.
That's so interesting. And it is, I think it's a cause for hope that everything we're talking about here is a kind of systemic activism that doesn't view just one sector as the problem, but tries to look at the whole chain and intervene at numerous points in that chain to try and solve it. And that's reason for hope, because people are motivated to do that. Lynn, it's reason for hope, but boy, is it a dramatic challenge. One of the things that's so hard about dramatizing issues like this is that drama seems constructed to be contained within individual lives. So you follow one person's story and that's what you've got. And it's very hard to explain a system through following one person. So you've come up.
Yeah, I think that's why I chose to tell the story from the point of view of the elephant, because that's the one individual who's really taking the full journey. Because, as you said, it is a system, and it's a complicated system. And if I tried to tell it from the point of view of just one person, it would be an epic play. And so I thought very quickly I'm able to show show the process of the ivory trade through everyone who touches the elephant.
Right. And it's just, I mean, what I love about that, and again feels very Lynn Nottage to me, is that it's basically figuring out a dramatic form that will solve a problem based on how do you talk about a system.
Yes.
Yeah, how do you do that? It's beautifully done.
Thank you.
So I need to just sort of close by asking, what should we be doing? What can we do? What is to be done? And I would love if you'd just talk to a little bit about what's the biggest thing you want to say to us?
Well, I think especially for this community, the cultural community in New York, we need more stories like Lynn's. We need to find more ways to tell that story that touches people's lives. I think that is sometimes the problem that we face, especially on some environmental issues and issues like this. When it touches you personally, when you're able to make that connection, it helps to then move policy and move a policy agenda. So I just keep doing what you're doing, and more importantly, the public theater, what you're doing to help tell these stories in a meaningful way, and providing that forum is incredibly important.
Thank you. Chelsea, do you want to say anything?
Well, I just want to echo, Oscar, what you said. I thought Lynn did such a remarkable job of telling a complex story in an accessible way that didn't sacrifice the complexity. So I'm not surprised that kind of doing that is one of your kind of guiding principles for when you write, because that was very apparent to me in the audience on Friday. I completely agree with John. I mean, we need more people to be able to see MLIMA'S TALE and work kind of in this area so that people do feel connected. Also, hopefully, they'll feel empowered to do something, whether it's just ensuring that they and no one they know ever buys ivory. Right? Maybe the most depressing part of this conversation was your anecdote from the New York Times photographer. And it says to me that we just haven't done our jobs well enough yet. And because if we have people still here in New York who are talking to the author of MLIMA'S play, you don't know kind of where ivory comes from. I mean, maybe it would be one thing if this were like a serendipitous conversation you had on the subway, but this person came to photograph you while this play was up at the public. I mean, oh my goodness gracious. So please just give us tools that we can use to not only like celebrate and show our gratitude for your work, but also ensure that kind of that conversation won't happen again.
Can I answer that question as well? It's something that you touched upon, Oscar, is like, I think that there needs to be more cross-fertilization of ideas. As a writer, so often I find that I am stuck in my little hole and my orbit is very small, and when someone is able to penetrate that orbit and introduce me to a new idea, suddenly there's something that I want to engage with. And I think there are a lot of artists and writers like myself who are hungry for ideas and hungry for engagement and just don't know where to find them.
And how can we help you? I'm sorry, Oscar, I didn't mean to preempt. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
We were thinking exactly the same thing, which is you can help
should
us.
I come to your house every Friday and be like, so?
Or you can come to the public theater. But I'm serious. Is that this is something that I love this story because this is about somebody who is passionate about a subject, coming to Lynn with the idea and saying, "Can you get passionate about this too?" Nothing would delight me more than for people to view the public theater as a place they come not just with a new play, but with an idea of an issue that needs to be talked about.
That is
so
a
that
dangerous
problem solved
Oscar.
together.
Oscar.
Oscar, you are opening up a Pandora's
Good.
box.
Good.
No, it'd be great.
We are ready for that. I mean, if I could just use an example, a historical example. When Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart premiered at this play at this theater in 1985, Frank Rich's review contained more information about the AIDS crisis than the New York Times had published in the 4 years of the crisis's existence. The use of the word AIDS in the New York Times by the end of 1985 or 86, half of the time AIDS was mentioned was in relationship to The Normal Heart. It is possible for the theater to penetrate a kind of cultural silence that is spills out beyond the boundaries of the stage. When I'm happy to say that the day after opening, MLIMA'S TALE showed box office results that would have told you that we were producing a major hit musical. It was just extraordinary response from the public to the show. And so I'm really confident that there are ways that we in the cultural community, we in the theater, can be helpful in amplifying in a different way the voice of your voices and voices about these kind of issues, and nothing is a more noble a pursuit for us.
Thank you so much, Oscar.
Well, I want to thank you guys for being here. Thank Lynn for writing this play. Thank you, John and Chelsea, for the work you're doing, which is so inspiring. You know, again, it's almost back to where we started. The idea that activism can work, the idea that if we make cooperative networks of people pulling in the same direction, we can do things that seem impossible about change. That's so necessary for us. I also want to just do a brief shout out to Susan Edelstein, who she and David's support made MLIMA'S TALE possible here at the public, and we never forget that, Susan. So thank you very much, and I believe we've concluded our public forum.
Oscar, thank you so much.